Welcome back to Face the Nation. Now for our political all-star panel. Michael Duffy is the deputy managing editor for Time. The cover story this week is Finding God in the Dark. Peggy Noonan is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and author of John Paul the Great, Remembering a Spiritual Father. David Ignatius is a columnist for the Washington Post. And of course, John Dickerson is our CBS News political director. We've got a lot to talk about this morning, but first, there was some violence overnight in Ukraine. This is pro-Russian protesters continue to control many government buildings in the east. And our Holly Williams filed this report from Slaviansk.
Ukraine's pro-Russian separatists are locked in an uneasy standoff with the country's government. Here in eastern Ukraine, the separatists have occupied public buildings in around 10 towns and cities, and some of those buildings were seized by masked, gun-wielding militants. Here in the town of Slaviansk, there was a fatal shooting last night, with reports of at least one person dead, though it's still not clear who was responsible. The fear here is really that this will spiral into civil war and split Ukraine in two. But this is clearly also a test of Russia and whether Moscow will continue to intervene militarily in its neighbouring countries. On Thursday, the US, Russia, Ukraine and the EU reached a deal in Geneva to try to end this crisis. It offered the separatists amnesty if they disarm and leave the buildings they've occupied. But that hasn't happened, and Ukraine's government and the US continue to blame Moscow for stirring up unrest here. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, has denied orchestrating this insurgency, but he's also said that if there's violence here, Russia has the right to intervene militarily in Ukraine. Holly Williams, CBS News, Slaviansk.
David, let's talk about this growing violence, the diplomatic efforts stalled. What does this say about Secretary Kerry's efforts?
Well, obviously they're not going as far as fast as he had hoped. It was typical that today there was an Easter truce that was violated in eastern Ukraine. I think there are two bad things about what Secretary Kerry negotiated last Thursday in Geneva, and one good thing. The two bad things are, first, the negotiation was done with a gun to the head of the Ukrainian government. Russian troops were massed, maybe 40,000 of them, just across the border. It was not a normal negotiation. The second thing, you'd have to say that a few days later, that agreement has not led to the stand down of forces that was discussed. The good thing is that Russia has begun talking to the Ukrainian government, and that's the only way that this crisis is going to move towards some resolution. It's got to be done by the Ukrainians with Russia, and even today, with today's bad news, that's still a prospect.
Mm-hmm. Well, what does it say about President Obama?
Well, the administration has said that if further actions by the Russians and Putin take place into Ukraine, it will up the kind of sanctions it's been talking about and willing to actually put into place. What's unclear, though, is whether Putin really has to go further. By taking over 10 to 15% of Ukraine, that's about what they control, the paramilitaries control. Putin is effectively paralyzing the nation, because by controlling all of it, he sort of shuts down the autonomy of the rest of it. And that's really Putin's goal. He may not have to go further, because he's, at the moment, sort of taken Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and reoriented it back toward the east, away from democracy, away from economic reform, and away from the West.
But I'm fascinated by this relationship, or lack of relationship, between President Obama and President Putin. And Peter Baker of the New York Times reports today on the front page that the president's advisors have concluded that the president will never have a constructive relationship with Mr. Putin. Peggy, what are the consequences of that?
Oh, you gotta wonder how that works as a strategy. Do you know what I mean? A strategy of, well, essentially, we're not speaking, or we're giving up. I know, or at least it's been in the press a lot, that Putin and President Obama have spoken on the phone a number of times during this crisis. I guess the president feels that's going nowhere, but that seems to me a sidebar of the essential question. The essential question is, what strategy is the United States going to adopt as Putinism is on the move? In where it is, obviously this is not just an immediate crisis. It is going to be a long-running one. It's run for a while now, and you can see where it's going in the future. I also wondered, connected to that report, if I may say, your report from the ground, the extent to which the pro-Russian separatists are in fact a Russian covert operation. I would think substantial, but I'm not on the ground there. I don't know.
The administration certainly thinks they are basically a part of the Russian government. What's interesting this week was, as this agreement was being put together in Geneva, the president was already saying, I'm not sure this is going to follow through. He was skeptical in the moment, because it's not just an agreement with anybody, unless it's an agreement with Putin himself and he sticks to it. That's the only thing that anybody can be sure of, but nobody can be sure of what he's going to do. And the question is, Peter Baker mentioned containment. This isn't containment in the sense that there's a global ideological fight over communism versus capitalism. It's a containment of the damage that Putin can do as he goes about following his schemes. But the question is, okay, you can try and contain him, but what about the areas, and David knows this so well, Syria and Iran, where we have interests where we need to deal with Russia?
That's a great point.
Well, I think the White House feels that to the extent that Putin still wants to be seen as a figure on the global stage, he really has to continue to work with the U.S. In Syria, certainly on the chemical weapons disarmament, and probably also in the Iran negotiations. What I hear from the negotiators who've been meeting recently is that the Russians have continued to be part of those talks. Basically, Obama thinks that Putin, although he's looked strong, he's looked like a bully in this period, is playing a weak hand, that he's now aroused all the Europeans to be much more skeptical of him. He's reinvigorated NATO. There will be NATO military movements. I think the U.S. is going to be putting troops into the Baltic states, which is something we promised in the 90s we would not do, at least on short-term rotations. So all those things are against Putin's interest, and I think President Obama is saying, look, Vladimir, are you really that happy with what you've ended up with here? You know, you have a volatile, used to be a client state, now it's a state in great turmoil.
Since it is Easter, let's turn from something dark to something light. We saw Pope Francis this morning in St. Peter's Square holding an Easter Mass. It was a sunny day there, more than 100,000 packed to hear his Easter Mass. Peggy, what about this Pope Francis effect?
Oh, I think it is considerable. I found very interesting, and what I thought was a remarkable interview with Cardinal Dolan this morning that you had. I found it very interesting that you pressed the Cardinal on what real substantive changes has Francis made. We all know he is embracing, and he's irrepressible, and he's warm, and that's a matter of style, as you and the Cardinal said. But I also think there's something more going on with Francis, and he showed us that in one of his first interviews when he became Pope, and he referred to the world as a hospital, a field hospital in the middle of a battle. And he sort of said, we are going to stop doing these narcissistic doctrinal arguments about things that obsess the West. We are going to speak of Christ in the world and his healing embrace in the field hospital. And what he meant by the healing embrace was Christ's love. That's a kind of shift in emphasis that is more than style, I think.
And he puts his money where his mouth is. So we're used to seeing images of the Pope in the so-called Pope-mobile. We're used to seeing these big gatherings. But when he goes down and sees a man whose face is covered in tumors and embraces him, that is acting in the field hospital. And it also, for Catholics, has all of this resonation. I mean, St. Francis himself, 13th century, scared of lepers, embraces a leper. Christ, that is the message of Christ. So here he's not just saying the right things, he's doing, it's religion you can use, and that's what's so appealing in you talking to Catholics and non-Catholics.
But I mean, I asked him about gay marriage and civil unions, and of course the church is not going to change on those things. But there is reform needed in the Vatican, many reforms needed, and it's not yet clear what those reforms will be.
He referred to the Pope as sort of, he talked about his simplicity. The word I think that really describes his humility. The foot washing thing was important because, of course, that's a reversal of power. That's the powerful ministering to the helpless. To some extent, the most interesting thing I think the Pope's done the last couple of weeks actually took place in a Lenten Mass a few weeks ago, where he's about to go take confession from a number of people, and instead of doing that, he stops, breaks away from what was clearly the plan, and goes to a normal priest at a normal confession booth right next to him, and takes, in front of the throngs of St. Peter's, takes confession himself as a man.
Oh, that's so touching.
And now that is a message of mercy and forgivis that he's not only trying to teach his priests because he thinks they haven't been so good at that, but also the rest of us.
He has shown the world what leadership is, and he's shown the difference that a new personality, imbued obviously with deep faith, can do to reinvigorate an institution. And the fact that on this Easter Sunday the world is talking about Francis as somebody who's really changed the way we think about things, as expressed so well by Cardinal Dolan in talking about him, that's a big change in the world.
You heard him make sort of an endorsement for Jeb Bush running for president, and it's a nice way for us to segue to Jeb Bush and 2016 politics, because there's lots to talk about on that front. John, what's the biggest impediment for Jeb Bush to getting in this race?
Well, there's a competition for the biggest impediments because he's got a few. I mean, let's focus just a narrow one. I mean, one is he hasn't run a race since 2002. Things have changed a lot in politics. He is not necessarily a happy warrior kind of fellow, and presidential campaigns right now would test the happiest warrior. I mean, Hubert Humphrey would be in tears. The constant pinging of the abuses of the presidential campaign, and he would be attacked on both his family legacy, not just about Iraq, but about his father's supporting of tax increases, his brother's lack of spending restraint. Conservatives don't like those two things. That's why the Bush name was booed at a recent gathering of conservatives in New Hampshire. Common Core, the educational standards that the Cardinal talked about, education. Well, this is an issue that a lot of conservatives in the grassroots don't like, these national standards. So there are issue reasons, family reasons, and also just personal reasons that he would have some hurdles. But there's also no front runner in the Republican Party, and he has a name, and so he would have a shot.
You know, Peggy and I were talking about this before the show, that people who know Jeb really well say that he has gone from being almost dismissive of this moment, of this round, this cycle, to being considerably more, I don't want to say coy, but less dismissive. And that signals to them that it's a serious consideration.
There was also some news this week that could affect the 2016 presidential race, but it came from Chelsea Clinton. Let's listen.
Mark and I are very excited that we have our first child arriving later this year. And
then, of course, Hillary Clinton tweeted that this will be my most exciting title yet, grandmother-to-be. Most exciting title yet.
Well, go ahead.
What could she possibly be thinking about 2 years hence? Hillary Clinton is the presumptive favorite for the Democratic nomination in 2016 to an extent that I think is fascinating and should be worrying for Democrats. If Hillary Clinton announced tomorrow she doesn't want to run or something else happened, who would there be? And it's really striking. You look at the Republican field, there are a lot of smart, young, dynamic Republicans with something to say. You look at the Democratic side, it's very hard to find somebody who, if Hillary stumbled, would be there ready to move in, and that should worry Democrats.
Yeah, I think so. She freezes the field as long as nobody knows what she's going to do, and so nobody can come up, break through, be the guest on the show who kind of dazzles you in 20 minutes. I would also say about Jeb Bush, by the way, there is a certain sense that I have that maybe he himself doesn't know if he's going to move forward, but he knows the eyes of the press and the political establishment are on him, and he's going to use that focus to advance the things he wants to advance. Immigration, Common Core, education, etc. So I think that may be going on a little bit there.
John, on Hillary, we learned that her book is going to be out in June. The publisher of the book, Simon & Schuster, which is a division of CBS News, here's the cover right here. It's been released, and it's called Hard Choices.
Yeah, I mean, so we're all, I mean, it's better than times I blinked under pressure. So this is both, if you're going to run, you want to get your story down on paper before you run. So this is both if she's going to run, getting her story out, but it's also a kind of what does a president do? They make hard choices. So it's kind of like, here, I've already done it. And remember that famous ad, the 3 a.m. phone call that she ran against Barack Obama, saying when the call comes, he has no experience, he won't be able to do it. Well, it actually, at the time, turns out she hadn't had a lot of 3 a.m. phone calls either. Now she has had some, and if she's running, that's what this book is about. I've been through, made hard, tough choices. I'm ready to go.
I think she's had an amazing week. She says the name of her book is Hard Choices, which may or may not have anything to do with her decision about whether to run for president. And two, she won the Chelsea primary. She'd been campaigning for years, to get to have a grandchild. They've won that now. Bill was quite outspoken about it. They both were. So I think we can go on to the next contest.
Yes. Well, the publisher is describing this as an inside account of the crises, choices, and challenges that Clinton faced during her years as Secretary of State. But David, how important and how much do you think this book will signal about what she wants to do in the future? Or do we already know that she's running for president?
I think we're assuming that she has that fire in her that her husband certainly had and still has. By publishing this book, and my sense talking to her is that she really is going to tell us about what it was like to be Secretary of State.
In Benghazi.
She's putting her chips on that idea that she was a strong, effective leader of American foreign policy. She's not just a former First Lady, she's not just a former senator. She made these hard choices. And the problem with that is that if you compare Secretary Clinton, who I think was a solid Secretary of State, with her successor, John Kerry, you see what a dynamic Secretary of State who didn't just make hard choices, who went out there day after day after day trying to make diplomatic agreements.
Put himself on the line.
And that comparison, I think, won't work in Secretary Clinton's favor. She can say, I was a solid secretary, but compared to what Kerry's attempted, she just wasn't really at that level.
I think part of the purpose of this book, is pinging off what David is saying, part of the purpose is to refute the idea out there that as Secretary of State, she was not a significant player in the creation of U.S. foreign policy. She was a person put on a plane and sent to Manila to be on Good Morning Manila. Do you know what I mean? It was different from Secretaries of State in the past, and I think she's going to try to say in this book, oh, no, I was very involved in the bubbling up and creation of U.S. foreign policy.
I think she's revealed there's an entire chapter on Iran, which is, I think she's going to make as a point of where they did make some progress.
Well,
at least
she
with
got that
sanctions.
story started. That's I think one of the most interesting parts of this book, my guess is she will tell us how the initial secret contacts with Iran began under her secretaryship with her mandate, and that's going to be news.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Go ahead.
I was going to say, don't forget, she's got some things to answer for, too. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates has written a book that was in places quite critical of her, particularly about her political look at certain issues overseas. We'll see how she answers those, because those will be read side by side.
All right, we have more to talk about, so we'll be right back with more of our panel. We're back with more of our panel. One of the major issues in this fall's midterm election is Obamacare, and the president came to the White House briefing room last week to champion the fact that 8 million Americans have signed up for health insurance, and he gave this advice to Democrats running for re-election.
I don't think we should apologize for it. I don't think we should be defensive about it. I think there is a strong, good, right story to tell. If Republicans want to spend all their time talking about repealing a law that's working, that's their business. I think what Democrats should do is not be defensive, but we need to move on and focus on the things that are really important to the American people right now.
John, not be defensive, but did he say Democrats should run on it?
No, he didn't, and it's some interesting movement here. In February, he spoke to the Democrats in the House who were having a retreat, and he said, in 5 to 10 years, we will look back on this law as a monumental achievement. And some people in the audience thought, but our election's in November, not in 5 to 10 years. They want the president to give them air cover, and it should be noted that February the numbers weren't as good as they look right now. And so what the president's doing is hoping for those Democrats running is to give them air cover so that perhaps they can neutralize this issue. So you won't see a lot of Democrats, let's look at those senators running for re-election in Republican states. They're not rushing out to herald the 8 million signups and so forth. But they hope if the temperature is lowered on the Affordable Care Act, they can then talk about their issues. They can get some oxygen in the air to talk about their opponent and how bad their opponent is. And so the president is doing work in that way that Democrats are happy to see him do, and they're all very happy to have something good to say after many days of not having having something so good to say.
But it's hurt the Democratic Party in this year's elections, no doubt, despite the encouraging numbers.
Right, because the polls are still very much against Obamacare, though rising a bit, and because the launch was so disastrous. The 8 million number that they announced this week of people who had signed up under the exchanges is more than even they had expected. It's not exactly clear how many of them are new health insurance owners, or how many of them will stay with the program and actually pay the premiums. That'll be probably some weeks or if not months before we know that. That's another reason why I think the Democrats probably aren't excited about running on this year. But it's interesting that the president is talking about it after having not talked about it that much in the last campaign. And we'll see what the party, which has its own troubles in the fall, will do.
I think one of the questions is how many people still to this day, it's hard to get the number, simply lost their insurance in the past few months, and how many of those were, if you lost your insurance, you were really told you got to go on the exchange. So the number, to say 8 million, to suggest that 8 million got brand new insurance and to give the impression that they had not been insured, I don't think that quite works. I also think Americans have a day-by-day, familial, company-oriented sense of how this thing is working, Obamacare, and I don't think they probably feel, wow, this was great, let's do that one again. So I think it remains as a blanket suppressing for Democrats in the coming election. I think it is now, and I suspect it will be in the future. I also think the decision the president just made on Keystone Pipeline will probably be difficult for Democrats running for the Senate, especially the ones most vulnerable at the moment. Yeah, the decision to delay Keystone. I don't feel the president has done his party a lot of favors recently.
He's looking to his own legacy. I think what John cited in his comments to House members says it all. In 5 or 10 years, this will look great, and I'll look great. The most important number I thought that came out last week was that the estimate of the costs of medical care have gone down by $100 billion over the next umpteen years. And if Obama can succeed in that aspect of the Affordable Care Act, driving down the costs of this wildly expensive system, he really will have done something important. The problem is that's going to hurt for a lot of people. As costs are cut, your access to certain things that you counted on isn't going to be there. So it's sort of either way, it may be the right thing to do, but in terms of politics, hard to see a benefit.
All right. Well, thanks to our political panel. Happy Easter, happy Passover to everyone. Thank you all, and we'll be right back.